Hello everybody, and thank you so much for joining me back on my channel, Hierarchy of Reads. My name is Tiffany, and today I'm going to be doing a book review for one of the books that I read in January, and that book was The Road to Jonestown, Jim Jones and People's Temple, written by Jeff Guinn. I've actually already filmed this video, but when I went to go edit it, the camera quality was not very good. It was all blurry, so this is the second time around. Fellow content creators know all about that frustration. But I do want to let you all know that I will be sharing some spoilers, if you can call it that, in this book review. Of course, this book is based on real events that happened many years ago, but I will be sharing kind of details that maybe are lesser known or details that I personally found to be pertinent and interesting. So I just want to let you all know that. So this book follows the trajectory of Jim Jones's life from childhood to his death in 1978. Now, Jim Jones is most well known for being the leader of the People's Temple Church and also for being the designer and perpetrator of the Jonestown massacre that happened on November 18th, 1978. On this day, 918 people died in what is commonly referred to as a revolutionary suicide or a mass suicide by drinking cyanide flavored with Flavor Aid. I personally have a pretty serious issue with referring to this event as a suicide, but for reasons that I'll explain shortly. Now, one of the things I really appreciated about this book was how the author, Jeff Guinn, did his best to be objective above all else. That's really very evident. You know, how easy it would have been to paint Jim Jones as this demonic evil masked in human flesh, but how much better a conversation we can have when we see him for what he truly was, a deeply flawed human being. I also appreciated the fact that the author didn't take cheap shots at temple members. He approached it in a very compassionate way. Again, his goal seemed to be objective and to understand instead of judge. And so that was something that I really appreciated. And finally, I appreciated the level of detail that the author was able to get into without ever making me feel overwhelmed with, fluff. I really think that the way he wrote this book was accessible and easy to read, but also was meaningful in its analysis. And I really think it showed, his master of the nonfiction craft. Now, the burning question on the back of my mind that was present while I was reading this book is the same question that I imagine is on the back of everybody's mind when they think about Jim Jones. And that is, was he evil or was he sick? The question in and of itself, the fact that I asked myself that question, really served as a reminder that nothing and no one is ever that simple. And that to seek an answer to this false dichotomy would really be to blind me to some of the complexity and nuance. I think it's really important to remember the humanity in atrocities and crimes because it's important in preventing them in the future and to understand how things were able to happen as they did. So often we like to think of these kind of events as supernatural evil, and us humans living in the natural world are not really vulnerable to the threats that they pose. This kind of separation allows us to feel a false sense of protection against being victims of these kinds of atrocities, or perhaps worse yet, being perpetrators of these kinds of atrocities. And though I understand the inclination to dehumanize, I think that it's vital that we put our discomfort aside, we put our vulnerabilities aside so we can develop a deeper understanding of what exactly happened here. Now, the book is 468 pages or so there's no way I could possibly fit all of that valuable information and all of that relevant information into this book review without it being ridiculously long. But I do think that there are some key points that we must understand about Jim Jones in order to understand his motivations and kind of potential causal factors in his overall trajectory. For starters, I think it's safe to say that Jim Jones had a rough time growing up. His mother was very cold, distant, and resentful, and his father was a disabled war veteran neither one of them were really able to care or provide for him in the way that children need. Another thing that's kind of interesting about Jim Jones is even early on in his life, he seemed to be obsessed with three main topics, and those were sex, death, and socialism. And those obsessions seem to continue on throughout most of his life. Another interesting thing about Jim Jones is that although he is known as a leader of the People's Temple, a leader of a church, Jim Jones was not particularly religious, especially not in his adult life. In fact, Jones openly criticized the church and religious beliefs and practices. But he did use the church and religious beliefs in order to lure people in and keep them there. He even used a lot of the kind of like church culture in order to attract followers. You know, he would do very energizing sermons. He would, have spectacular choirs. He would even do faith healings and prophecies. Another important factor to understand about Jim Jones is that even from a young age, he had a propensity for delusions about himself, about others, about the world. And throughout his conversations with people, again, even early on, it was very clear that he had a little bit of a disconnect from reality. This disconnect from reality seems to have grown over time. One thing that many people don't know that I found interesting, and I didn't know until I read the book, was that Jim Jones and his wife Marceline were responsible for a number of actually very positive outcomes in the beginning of their church. He helped people of color speak to the government when the government was ignoring them. He helped people get jobs. He helped people with financial issues. He paid for many people to go to school. They attended a number of community service events at whatever community they were in at the time. He even opened up a elder care hospital, and it was a legitimate business, a legitimate hospital, and they even opened up a rehabilitation center, which many young adults used to get sober. He genuinely seemed to care about oppressed people, at least in the very beginning. Though it took a while for him to kind of build up his church, build up the membership, build up the flow of things, build up the power and influence, he eventually got there. And for a while, things seemed to be going great. But Jim Jones had a tendency to self-sabotage whenever things were going great, and as soon as he did, things went downhill quickly. One of the ways that this manifested itself was in his increasingly impulsive and erratic sexual behavior. Now again, I mentioned that Jim Jones had been kind of obsessed with sex pretty much all of his life. From what we know, Jones doesn't seem to have strayed outside of his marriage in the beginning. However, just imagine that as he grew in popularity and power, here is this man who comes off as very charismatic, is seen as very wise and all-knowing. He's powerful, he's again charismatic, and as you can imagine, there are many young women who are interested in him, and he most certainly reciprocated that interest. And over time, he began to have sexual interactions with many people in the church, men and women alike. In fact, I didn't know this, but one of the things I found interesting was that there are some people who believe that part of his obsession with sex was due to his sort of suppressed bisexuality. He never really got to kind of be open about that part of himself, but he did occasionally engage with sex with men in the church as well. Now at first, his sexual behavior was a little bit uncomfortable for his wife and for the women that he was engaging in sex with. Some of them didn't know about each other, but things really got to get problematic later on. There was one point that we know that he engaged in sexual behavior with a minor. I believe she was about 14 years old. And way later on, when he's in Jonestown, there's a situation in which he's having sex with a woman and it's consensual, but when she tells him that she's not interested in him, he decides to drug her, bring her to his cabin so he can have sex with her and rape her whenever he wants. So it does seem that his sexual inclinations and impulsivities become increasingly out of control as time goes on. I think that one of the factors that contributed to this is one of the same factors that contributed to his kind of general degradation over time, and that was his excessive drug use and abuse. I don't remember the exact time frame in which he started using drugs, but he used drugs for a long time, and he used them very recklessly. I think that his drug use exacerbated his delusions and disconnect from reality, kind of stopped any inhibitions he might have had from the beginning, and really muddied his ability to think clearly. Now, eventually, he moves part of his church from the United States to Guyana. And in Guyana, they were to make a settlement that was supposed to be a manifestation of the most perfect socialist community. But it seems as though when he finally did move to Guyana, things went downhill extremely quickly. He faced numerous legal charges against him for things such as kidnapping and holding people there against their will. He also found that it wasn't as easy to sustain Jonestown as he originally thought that it would be, and it was so much more costly than he imagined it would be. And the longer that they were in Jonestown, the more defectors he had, the more people wanting to leave Jonestown and go back to the United States. And this deeply insulted him. He felt personally betrayed by every single person who wanted to leave Jonestown. I think this really speaks to the fragility of his ego and sense of self and his need for power, because even though there were many people who wanted to leave, most of his followers, who at this time there were about 1,000 people living in Jonestown, were still fiercely loyal to him. But if he wasn't in total and complete control, he felt vulnerable and he felt as though everything would be taken away from him. So when a US congressman named Leo Ryan went to Jonestown to do some inspections and investigate, things became tragic very quickly, not just for Jim Jones, not just for Leo Ryan, but everybody in Jonestown. In the end, 918 people died on November 18th, 1978. The majority of people in Jonestown died by drinking Flavor Aid laced with cyanide. Now, I previously mentioned in this video that many people refer to this event as a revolutionary suicide or a mass suicide. However, I fundamentally disagree with that classification. For starters, there were 200 to 300 children that were in Jonestown. Children cannot consent. They were murdered. Beyond this, we also have numerous vulnerable and elder adults who were also given the Flavor Aid laced with cyanide, and they didn't have much of a choice either. Again, to me, that's classified as murder. And finally, even if we considered the numerous adults who seemed to willingly consume this poison, I argue that they truly did not give their consent. For starters, Jones was known for doing loyalty tests in which he commonly gave his followers liquids, told them it was poison, told them that this was, the final test, and they would drink it thinking that they were going to die, and then he would tell them that it wasn't in fact poison, he was just testing their loyalty. This had to have desensitized them to the threat over time, and it seems very likely to me that many of the adults that were there drank the liquid not really thinking it was actually poisoned, but thinking that it was just another one of his loyalty tests. Beyond this, even if those who drank the drink knew that it was in fact poison, I firmly believe that if a person's judgment is significantly under question, they cannot give consent. And I argue that years of manipulation, control, abuse, isolation, the fact that they were possibly drugged the day before, all of that interferes with a person's ability to give consent. And so again, even to those adults, I don't think it was suicide, I think it was murder. Now, reflecting on all of this, there's a sick and twisted irony in this story. Here is a man who he wanted to help the oppressed people and rescue them and protect them. And in the end, he exploited them, manipulated them, betrayed them, and murdered them. As the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. This seems to bring us back to that original burning question that I had in the back of my mind. Was Jim Jones evil, or was he sick? Did he commit these murders because he genuinely believed in his delusions, or was he simply unable to accept his own failure, and so he manufactured an ending that gave him the false illusion of control? Likely it was both, and more. Human beings are so complex, and a lot of times when things like this happen, we want a simple answer where no simple answer exists. There are endless factors that could have contributed to who he turned out to be, what motivated him, why he did what he did, how he did what he did. And unfortunately, we're never able to know the true answer. If we think about the factors that I discussed earlier from a diathesis stress model, there are numerous factors that could have contributed to his likeliness to do such an act or his propensity to be able to commit such an act, but that's not the complete story. Even if we were able to sit down with him one-on-one and have an interview, we would still have trouble understanding, let alone, when we think about that we're going off of secondary and tertiary sources. My point is not that these sources are inaccurate, but that they're incomplete and have a limited scope in really revealing what his insights and motivations and thoughts were. Now, some of you might hear my review and feel frustration or anger at the fact that I'm not talking about Jim Jones with explicit contempt. For the record, I am not condoning, justifying, or making excuses for his acts. His acts are horrific. But at the same time, I think that it's possible to be objective and be willing to openly understand a situation from a non-judgmental perspective while also keeping in mind that the actions were very, very wrong. In fact, I think it's vital that we explore situations like this at a much deeper level instead of sitting on the surface screaming about how it's evil. I think understanding these complexities and nuances are also important in understanding and empathizing with the temple members. When you really think about it, these people were everyday people just like you and I. They were people who were looking for a cause they believed in, looking for community, looking for love. And here Jim Jones came in offering all of that to them. So often we not only like to alienate ourselves from the perpetrators of these horrific crimes, but also the victims of them. Because if we acknowledge that they're people just like you and I, then we must also acknowledge the vulnerability that we have. But in all this, I think there are so many lessons that we can take away from this book and really dissecting the story. And so one of them is really about being critical of yourself, of your thought process, and critical of others at all times, even if it's somebody that you adore. And I think this is a really important subject, but my camera's gonna die, so I'm trying to rush through this right quick. But first, I just really quick wanna read a quote that the author of this book said in an interview, which I'll link in the description box below. And that is, "The greatest talent of a demagogue is to be able to appeal to alienated people." I think that's something that we should always keep in mind. Oftentimes we don't understand the full extent that we're being influenced or manipulated until it's far too late and either something has happened to us or we're reflecting back on how we sat out and watched atrocities happen or perhaps even engaged actively with them. If we ever find ourselves in a situation where we're blindly loyal to someone or believe that someone is beyond reproach, that is a blaring red flag that we need to step aside ourselves for a moment and really look at this objectively as possible, because otherwise it's so easy to get caught up in things that we never thought possible in the past. In the end, I ended up rating this book 4 out of 5 stars, and if you were interested in nonfiction, social psychology, particularly as it relates to cults and kind of persuasion in general, I think you would really enjoy this book and I highly recommend. That is all I have for you today. I do look forward to seeing you in my next video, but until then, be well.